Before the video starts, I have to give the usual warning. This video will contain spoilers for the entirety of Hunter x Hunter, including the manga. There will also be a mention of some topics that may be distressing to some viewers, so proceed with caution. This analysis may be quite speculative in some parts, so feel free to share your own opinions in the comments below. Just remember to act like civilized people while doing so. I personally believe Togashi is leaving out a lot to our own interpretation in the entire manga on purpose, many times leaving us to place the pieces together like a real hunter would. It can be almost detective work in some parts, so that's why I believe we should stay open to different theories and interpretations before we get anything more specific from the GOAT himself. With all that being said, let's dive into the analysis. Despite his quite short presence in the anime and the manga, Pariston left a lasting impression, and he might as well be one of the most well-written characters in the series, even if he isn't as fleshed out as some of the others as of yet. In this video, I plan to dive deep into his mind and dissect his very odd brain, as well as discuss some possible reasons what made him the way he is, what his real values and motives may be, and examine his character as well as some of the theories and mysteries surrounding him. In other words, this will not just be a simple rundown of what he did and what we saw him do on screen, but rather a deep dive into his character and all the possible implications of what he is, what he could become, and what it means for the world of Hunter x Hunter. Buckle up, kids, this one's gonna be a ride. Who is Pariston? The Red Zodiac, the 12th Vice Chairman of the Hunter Association, and a triple-star hunter. With his extensive administrative power and his high intelligence and manipulation skills, Pariston has become one of the, if not the biggest threat of Hunter x Hunter, and he did so without even needing to display any use of his Nen abilities whatsoever. In this first part, I'll quickly go over what Pariston did, because he knows what he did, and why he isn't just some silly manipulative politician, but actually an ominous threat to the entire world of Hunter x Hunter, and why even you should be seriously afraid of him as well. This is gonna be a short recap and background before we start the character analysis, but if you feel like you already know all of this, feel free to skip to this time. Pariston has been the vice chairman of the Hunter Association for 3 years, dealing with the business and administrative side of the association, as well as constantly challenging Chairman Netero, who chose him specifically for that purpose because he wanted a challenge, someone who is not a yes man by his side. The first we ever hear of Pariston is in Moral Speculation during the Chimera Ant arc, when he says that he thinks the vice chairman has somehow manipulated the committee into assigning quote-unquote the wrong man to the job, based on Pariston's political schemes and motives, rather than the skill needed to capture said Chimera Ant. However, as we're introduced to the Zodiacs and meet Pariston for the first time, we learn of an even more disturbing fact. 18. 18 is the number of hunters that went missing since Pariston became vice chairman. That is 6 missing hunters per year, 10 times more than the average number of 0.6 before he got appointed. What's even more disturbing is the fact that Pariston basically implied that the number will go down once he's chairman, meaning he either just acknowledged his involvement in those incidents, or he just said so to annoy our crime hunter Zodiac, just to tease him with the possibility of having ties to the underworld, or just being that shady. Moreover, there was also the money scandal with the temp agency funds going to his account, which he excused as just being stored there as a reserve fund for the association. Speaking of the temps, who Pion claims are basically like slaves to him, They are also serving him by being a major number of the votes he constantly maintains in the election. I won't go over the events of the election arc, because this video would be too long if I included all that. But in short, during the entire election process, we see Pariston take one small victory after another. Even despite being taken off guard at one point, he manages to stay in control, outplaying and annoying all his colleagues with ease through his intellectual scheming, analyzing, and calculating, as well as his flexibility in being able to adapt to any unexpected changes with a calm and calculated demeanor. However, once he manages to win the position of the chairman, he does the unexpected. After naming Sheila his vice chairman, he immediately steps down, which catches even the genius that Jing is off guard. After that, Sheila confronts him, and we see a very unexpected glimpse of what seems to be a real human emotion in Pariston, when he talks about how he is sad that he can no longer continue playing with Netero. He then threatens Sheila that it'll get serious if her association becomes boring, and leaves. Next time we see him is when we learn he quit the Zodiacs and is now on board with Beyond Netero and his expedition to the Dark Continent. This is then followed by Jing joining the team as well, confronting Pariston about his supposed forced choice of what he'd do to the association and possibly the entire world with the 5,000 chimera ants who know Nen, which he somehow acquired after Netero's death. Their intense confrontation with subtle homoerotic subtext continues for some time, with Pariston revealing his most iconic lines in the manga. Jing constantly annoys him by being quote-unquote too perceptive, by accurately analyzing his plans and character, as well as being too similar in his way of thinking. Pariston is annoyed by this to the point where he admits that he, for the first time ever, is starting to hate someone. Flash forward some time later, we learn that Beyond's assassins all failed the Hunter exam, and out of nowhere, Jing and Pariston are confronted by armed men. If I remember correctly, they're Muir's henchmen, who demand one of them leave before they proceed to attack them both. When the confrontation ends, Jing reveals that he knew it was a ploy by Pariston to make him reveal his ability all along. As Jing is slowly accepted as the new number 2, Pariston urges him that it not only be in name, but that he's curious how Jing will handle the responsibility, which Jing then accepts. Sadly, this is the last we see of both of them for now. If you want a good summary and analysis of these parts in the manga, I recommend checking out these two videos by Pariston Anime, which I hope I'm pronouncing right. But let's get back to the video now. Those were all the significant events you should remember for the analysis. Now, let's summarize Pariston in both appearance and character before we delve into the true depths of his soul. If he even has one, that is. Here's a list of some of the most important characteristics you should remember about Pariston, and I'll be going over some in detail later. Pariston is enigmatic and unreadable. He's charismatic, intelligent, observant, adaptive, ambitious, calm, almost tranquil to some extent. He's sly, cunning, and scheming, controlling, sadistic, as well as masochistic, as we'll see later. He's also conflicted, childish, especially when it comes to some form of being petty or arrogant, and he's also weak? Question mark? When it comes to his design, he is just as mysterious. I believe his design is one of the best in the series. On first glance, his design is almost too plain, and it perfectly reflects his mask. Him and Jing are the only two Zodiacs who did not change their appearance for Netero, One would argue that it's just because Pariston himself basically is a rat, so he doesn't need a rat costume. Which, yes, but also it could be argued that it's a part of his attempts to look like he's not one of them. Meaning, he's both sending a signal to the Zodiacs as in, I think I'm better than you, furry clowns, and also serving as, I'm just like you, to the less strong people he tries to appeal to throughout the entirety of the election. He is both plain and flashy, which immediately is supposed to give you the impression that, yeah, I hate this guy. Look at him sitting like a prince in that chair, pompous bastard. There is constant emphasis on a few things in his design. First, it's hands. A lot of hands and hand gestures, which I think it mostly is just a character quirk. Anyone with a hand fetish, though, would probably have a really good time reading the chapters with Pariston. Then there are, of course, all of his iconic suits, and his tall, slender figure, which only enforces the idea of him being quote-unquote weak. Then, I'd argue the most important and unique design feature of Pariston are his eyes, which are oddly cute? His eyes have the perfect innocent design, which greatly helps his harmless facade as well as it makes it even more unsettling given his real nature. His dark eyes seem almost empty, as if you were staring into an abyss, as if there was no real human emotion behind them. This is even more apparent in the situations where he is outright evil and manipulative, which, if you let me rant for just a few seconds, was so much better shown in this panel rather than this scene. I mean, the Japanese VA did a spectacular job, but otherwise, if you have an evil manipulative character doing vile things, you don't need to overly explain it in the visuals. Anyone who has basic media literacy will understand that evil actions equals evil character. You don't need to go out of your way to do this, when this feels much, much worse. In the sense that real evil people who don't mind hurting others do tend to look cute and harmless sometimes. That is what being manipulative is about. So, show don't tell applies here as well, just with the art style instead. It's much more realistic and even more ominous, the way that Pariston does these things so casually, rather than being reduced to a cartoon villain, or a 14-year-old's idea of what an edgy villain is supposed to look like. Now that I got that off my chest, the final most important part of Pariston's design is not any part of himself, but rather his environment. Many times, as he seems to be in control and awfully calm, we either see the sparks in the anime or mandalas around him. This is in stark contrast to the negative intent, or perhaps Ren, or even borderline bloodlust he displays later. This is both connected to the concepts of control and his contrasting nature that represents his inner conflict. Pariston's panels and he himself are full of contrasts. Whether it is the concept of love or hate, mandalas or bloodlust, black or white, order or chaos, Pariston's whole being seems to be full of contradictions, which finally gets us to the most important part of the video. Part 1. The game. Imagine if life was just a game. Everyone you meet is just an NPC. Every move you make or every dialogue option you choose impacts the storyline. You can adjust your character in any way you seem fit, and you can advance endlessly. With enough skill and patience, you can learn how the game works, how to overcome certain obstacles and beat certain bosses, constantly leveling up and up and up, until there is no more up to go. What do you do then? Do you relish in being the one who beat the game, enjoying the achievements and the status you gain by beating it? Or do you go and switch to another game so you could continue having fun? Because let's face it, however good it feels to beat a game, we all know how empty you feel once there is nothing else left to do. So, why do you play? To prove to yourself that you can do it? Or do you play just for fun? And that is exactly who Pariston is. He's not playing to win, yet he doesn't want to lose either. He just wants to enjoy the game and make it last as long as possible. And not just that, our favorite rat is a multitasker. He is able to focus on multiple long games at once, toying with Netero by throwing obstacles his way, simultaneously planning moves to help Beyond's expedition, while also making moves that will make his little election side task an easy win. He is the kind of person who doesn't mind making moves that will hinder his own progress, just so that the game goes on. In any scenario, he'll make sure the odds are somewhat balanced and fair, so that he actually beats his opponent with his real abilities instead of just getting lucky. He does not take an easy win, and is even offended if his opponents were to let him do so. He wants a challenge and a fair fight, a fair chance to show just what the difference between him and his opponent is. There are a few characters in Hunter x Hunter that share some of Pariston's characteristics. One of them is obviously stated to be Jing, and another is Netero. All three of them love to overcome obstacles and play their little games. Of course, there are some important differences. Jing himself said that he is far less patient than the other two. Another difference between him and Jing is the extent of which one would go to harm others. While both Jing and Netero seem to be selfish to an extent, Jing looks down on Pariston because he is not only willing to hurt others with his game, but even does so happily and on purpose. While most normal people do sometimes end up hurting the ones they care about, unwillingly and willingly, Pariston wants to do so to an extreme level, which makes Jing see him as a scumbag who loves in a very twisted way. Jing acknowledges that he himself might hurt the ones he cares about in pursuit of what he wants most, but Pariston is going out of his way to cause harm to the one he loves, which makes Jing uncomfortable just thinking about it. There is one more person in the Hunter x Hunter universe who has an uncanny resemblance to Pariston, and it's none other than Hisoka. I once saw someone mention that Pariston is just Hisoka in a suit, and I couldn't get rid of that feeling ever since. Both these men share a love for games and toying with people, and love power and control over others. Both want to enjoy themselves to the fullest and are very ambitious, not stopping at any obstacle to reach whatever their goal is, even if it is just having fun. Both are mischievous ENTP characters who love to mess with other people's minds, and both could classify as a representation of the trickster archetype. Both also disregard the lives of others if they are an obstacle or are in the way of their objectives, and most importantly, I believe both of them are powered by a very strong reaction to some past trauma. I'll go over Pariston's potential past in this analysis, and I'll also make a deep dive on Hisoka in the future to explain why I think it is the case. But let's not get sidetracked for now, we still need to discuss Pariston's love for playing a bit more. Pariston's desire to continue the game as long as possible which doesn't apply just to the elections, but his character in general, is what makes him both unpredictable and almost unbeatable, to the point where he may as well be the hardest opponent to have in Hunter x Hunter. Not only will he sabotage his opponents, but also himself, taking the power away from whoever has it at the moment, trying to stay within the gray area for as long as possible. He is completely unmanageable by everyone, including Netero himself. And let's face it, he is one of the biggest threats in the world. He has an army of 5,000 chimera ants who can use Nen. 5,000! You know what that means? There are over 600 hunters in the Hunter Association, paired with a few Nen users who don't have a license. That number is still far too low to stop whatever he decides to do with his newly acquired toys. If Pariston wanted to, he could just end the world, or at least cause absolute chaos and destruction with just those ants alone. And the ants are just an ace up his sleeve that he is willing to show. We didn't see him use them in the time that Jing anticipated, and the reasons for that could be many. Either he decided the association is now just too boring and he'll focus on Jing instead, or, which I think is a bit more likely, he's saving them for later. Either way, those ants are not just gonna disappear anytime soon. Speaking of Jing, the rivalry between these two deserves a whole another video, so I won't be going into much detail in here. But one thing we need to consider is that Jing right now may be the only person not only able to keep up with Pariston, but also outsmart him in some scenarios as well. Jing is now finally paying attention to Pariston, and he is fully determined to break his spirit. Because, as he said, even if he beat Pariston to a pulp, Pariston would probably just laugh about it, so he needs to beat him at his own game instead. Pariston was both desperate to find a new playmate, and had his eyes on Jing for quite some time now. Hence why he was so excited that Jing is finally paying attention to him and is in the mood to do this. However, Pariston very likely did not expect Jing to be this good at what is usually his own game. Not only he found a worthy opponent who seems to share his fondness for avoiding boredom at any costs, he also found someone who is not afraid to call him out directly, and more importantly, someone he cannot predict and control. Jing knows exactly how to annoy Pariston, how to break his spirit, and it is by playing his game while not playing by his rules. And Pariston is used to being the one toying with people, not the other way around. He's the one used to getting a reaction out of anyone, but it's Jing, the only person who is able to stir up those negative emotions in Pariston so well. Jing's presence is throwing Pariston off balance completely, which can be both seen in his still barely readable expressions, and also the patterns and graphics, displaying just how unstable he seems compared to his usual composed self. Pariston is not in control. He's giving Jing all his attention by completely giving up control over being Beyond's number 2, and for the first time ever, we get an insight into his thoughts. Jing messes with him well enough to the point that, for the first time ever, Pariston is starting to hate someone. Part 2. Love and Hate. Normally, as people love and are loved, they feel happiness. When I am hated by people, that is when I feel happiness. and then I want to tear apart and inflict unimaginable harm to the things I love. But is that really all that strange? I wonder. Reading those lines for the first time quite literally sent a chill down my spine. Never have I ever became so invested in a character so much from just 3 panels alone. But somehow Togashi did it again. Made me rethink an entire concept I was so comfortable believing in. I had to come back and keep rereading those words over and over again because it just made no sense to me. Yet at the same time, it spoke volumes of Pariston's character, explaining what we've seen so far and what we'll see in the future as well. A person who loves to be hated and feels compelled to hurt those he loves. Why? Why does he feel like that? What does that even mean for him and for those around him? How far is he willing to go? And how far has he gone already? Those were the questions on my mind for a few whole days since I read those pages, and it's something I got dedicated to find answers to for myself. Now, I am no psychologist, but let me cook here. I think we can all agree that no person, not a single one, is born into this world feeling like they want to be hated. It's a feeling so unnatural to human nature itself that just thinking about it broke my brain. Until I've thought about it enough to the point that it made perfect sense. Before I begin this part of the analysis, I want you all to remember that we need to know 2 things going into this. Firstly, Togashi does not shy away from tragic backstories, but he's not so fast to give us one either. The problem with giving a villain a tragic backstory is that people start to sympathize with them, which can be wrong. We need to separate the villain from the trauma. A tragic backstory is an explanation, not an excuse. I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of the reason Togashi might be hesitant to give us some other villain backstories too fast. We got the troops' traumatic childhoods in a chapter, and although it is sad, it in no way justifies what they did to the Kurta, especially the kids. Yet, there are some fans who are willing to ignore it just because the characters are too likable. A tragic story helps us understand why these characters are the way they are, and it should stay just that. We can't excuse the troop, Hisoka, Pariston, or any other villain when or if Togashi decides to drop another sad backstory. Once again, it's an explanation and not an excuse. That being said, the next part of the analysis might be a bit speculative, but it's based on what Togashi has shown us so far, and trust me, the manga is not short of giving us some hints already. So, like Jing would say, you're a hunter, so figure the rest out for yourself. I think this can be applied to many hints Togashi drops here and there, and some images in some of the panels in connection to Pariston I believe are in no way a coincidence. As I said before, nobody is born into this world wanting to be hated. Even some of the most evil and vile people walking among us still feel the need to keep their reputation and be seen in a somewhat positive light. So, what does bring one to wanting to be hated? And how can one form such an odd relationship with love? Jing calls Pariston a baby crying for attention in one of the translations, and basically an attention seeker in the Japanese original. As much of a sassy jab as it is, it has some truth to it, so let me explain. The only person that Pariston actually hates that we know of is Jing. I believe that's because A, like he says, they think in similar ways and he catches up to him almost too fast. B, he can't control, manipulate, or predict him like any other person in his life. And C, he is the person who got closest to somewhat understanding him. I think a lot of Pariston's hatred for Jing comes from some subconscious issues he has. I think it's a lot deeper than just that they think in similar ways, and it remains a question to what extent is Pariston actually self-aware in this aspect. Pariston really likes when things go his way or the way he expects, which is normal for hunters to an extent, especially given what Jing said to Beans. But I think with Pariston, this is just another extreme, given that his reaction to things not going his way for once, his reaction to this lack of control, is the intense dislike or even hatred he's starting to feel towards Jing. There is a stark contrast between how he's usually drawn with the tranquil mandala symbols in the background, and how he's drawn with the chaotic, messy, dark background when Jing catches him off guard, going completely from calm and composed to absolute chaos and destruction. From one extreme to another in just a few chapters. Just like the contrast of love and hate, this is the same inner conflict, just displayed in an artistic form in the manga itself. Pariston's character is incredibly complex and deep, and he displays his inner turmoil and conflicting emotions with his presence in the manga in how much his demeanor changes. Just by comparing these few panels alone, you can see how this is basically a black and white situation. Either everything is peaceful and perfect, or it is whatever this is. Even when he tries to hide it, his expression subtly changes in these panels, and Togashi did a spectacular job at depicting such conflicting emotions with just a few strokes. According to Jing, Pariston's views on love are twisted, which I don't think anyone doubts at this point, but the question remains. Why is he like this? With that being said, here comes a trigger warning for the following section. Let's examine the iconic panel. There is a destroyed tiled floor with a lot of mess all around it, including some broken alcohol bottles, a broken doll, some dying flowers, and some bloody razor blades lying around. I think this is most likely a hint at Pariston's childhood. Not only we see a polar opposite contrast again, with one happy household and one completely destroyed. In what is Pariston's panel, we see the razor blades covered in blood, which is a clear indicator of some form of self-harm, whether it is in the literal or just a symbolic sense. And there is also the broken doll, which can represent a destroyed childhood or a loss of innocence. I think with this panel, Togashi is trying to show us multiple things. I believe it means that Pariston's desire to be hated comes from a strong sense of self-hatred, as well as his tragic and unstable childhood. Pariston wants to be hated because it's what feels comfortable and familiar. Nobody with a stable sense of self and a normal amount of self-esteem wants to be hated by others. It's a form of a coping mechanism that most likely evolved over some time for him. What I think is conveyed in these panels is him wanting, perhaps subconsciously, the outer world to reflect his inner world. He wants to be hated because he wants the world to confirm what he already believes. He wants to hurt the few people that would actually want to stay around him, because if he hurts them, they won't feel the need to love him. If they don't love him, that confirms that he is unlovable, just like he believes. Being hated feels good to him because it's what he believes he deserves, and it's what he's always been used to. This brings me to my other point. His actions are clearly sadistic, but they are equally as masochistic. Again, a throwback to the razor blades. He doesn't have to be physically harming himself. Self-sabotage on such a profound level is enough. What he's doing is both keeping people at an arm's length, but also desiring attention at the same time. Hence, why he is so drawn to people like Netero and Jing being his playmates, meaning they both give him attention and somewhat understand his mind without actually loving him. I've heard a few people discuss the possibility that Pariston saw Netero almost like a father figure, which I think is a valid thing to think, given Jing's assessment of Pariston being almost like a bratty kid who just wants attention. And it seems that he did a lot to get just that. Attention from Netero in one way or another. I think Jing's analysis of Pariston is quite accurate, but we also need to keep in mind that he was surprised by him before, and given some of Pariston's reactions, I don't think Jing is always 100% right about him. But Jing's analysis is still just as close as we can get to the truth. Now for the really theoretical part of the analysis, Pariston's childhood. We can't know for sure what happened that made Pariston the way he is, but given the imagery, the hints, and his nature, I made a few conclusions, and again, you're free to speculate some more. My personal belief is that he was definitely neglected, if not abused. He didn't have the dream family shown in the first panel. Reality was much more grim for him. It's evident that he was not properly loved as a child, and that he's probably uncomfortable with just the idea of it. I think the only way Pariston ever got any attention as a child was when he caused some trouble. Even if it was negative attention, it was at least something. I believe his caregivers, if there were any, did not let him be loved for simply just existing like a normal child should. Either he'd have to cause trouble, or he'd have to always do his best, hence why he's always keeping up a performance now. And whatever the case was, if not both, he was constantly made feel like he's not good enough or worthy of love. I really think his childhood was difficult in many aspects that all led him to not loving himself and believing he was never enough and didn't deserve any love. There was no clear role model for love that he was shown, and that's why he is so drawn to people who give him attention without loving him, and ones that he constantly tries to both out-control and, in a sense, prove himself to. He wants attention and to be validated, but the only way he can think of getting it is through causing total mayhem. I genuinely think his beliefs reflect a deep internal conflict he has about himself, his own worth, and his views on the world itself. His character is full of contrasts and extremes, whether it be love or hate, black or white, mandalas or dark aura, and much more. His biggest challenge right now is Jing himself, and it's not just because he catches onto his plans or outsmarts him, it's much deeper than that. Jing breaks his black and white worldview. He challenges him not just intellectually, but also calls out his behavior and beliefs, hence why Pariston thinks he hates him now. But in reality, he's much more conflicted about it. He hates Jing, but he also, for the first time in his life, is facing an actual challenge, and he's determined to find out just what he wants to do to the one person who managed getting such a strong emotional reaction out of him. Love and hate are two sides of the same coin, is what of all people Hisoka once said. But is that really the case with Pariston? I think when it comes to him, the coin was run over by a steamroller, then dropped into molten lava, and when it came out, it was reshaped into something entirely different. In other words, Pariston is a mess, and we love him for it. Now, before I finish this segment of the video, since I touched on it quite a few times already, let me get back to the aspect of his contrasting or even conflicting nature and explain exactly what I mean by that. With Pariston, we don't really get into the gray area much, and a lot seems to be about extremes and polar opposites, which makes him seem both confusing and confused in some parts. We already know that he sometimes contradicts himself on purpose in order to manipulate others successfully, but that is not always the case. Let's take, for example, the self-deprecating comments he made, and then contrast that with how he told Jing that he's underestimating him. In this case, he didn't say that to intentionally throw anyone off. It feels more like this is coming from his own mindset. Does he or does he not want to be underestimated? Does he want people to fear him or feel that he's weak? And the answer is yeah, he wants both in a way. With him, it's always hard to tell if what he's saying is based on how he actually feels, but we'll get more into that later. For now, just know that he likes to twist his words however he deems necessary in order to manipulate other people's perception of him. However, that doesn't mean he's never saying what he actually thinks or feels. One such example is with Netero. He's not afraid to use his legacy in order to manipulate others, but at the same time, he seems to have cared about him, in his own way, of course. So, when it comes to others' perception of him, he somehow wants them to both underestimate him and not underestimate him? He's quite indecisive, this guy, isn't he? But that just goes back to what I said. Everything with Pariston is about extremes. You should either see him in one state or the other. But what's really important is that he makes you feel strongly about him. It's either this or that, no in between, but somehow it's always extreme. Which is a smooth segue into the next part of the analysis. Reading Pariston as a character with BPD. Now, before I get into this part of the analysis, I want to emphasize a few things. I've seen this sentiment repeated on many occasions in the community, and personally, if you have a diagnosis and you deeply relate to a character, that's completely valid. But we also need to remember when quote-unquote diagnosing fictional characters that it shouldn't be taken too seriously. It's up to the author to write a character in any way they want, and if we go for any interpretation, it can differ from what the author actually intended. So it's safest to just usually take just what the author says. Even if characters may display some signs of a certain mental illness or disorder in a fictional setting, they can always change if the author decides to do so. Unlike the people in the real world. So once again, I think it's alright to headcanon these things, but not take them too seriously. Because especially with Hunter x Hunter, the interpretation of many things is very subjective, especially with less fleshed out characters like Pariston. Though it's not always the case. Some people do misinterpret certain characters in a way that goes directly against what Togashi himself said, which is honestly quite disappointing. For example, Togashi doesn't need to specifically word for word say that Aluka is a trans girl, because it's what we learn. And if you call Aluka a boy, you're not only being a bigot, but you're also going against what Togashi himself wrote and intended. This is a bit of a tangent, but Togashi has always experimented with gender and sexuality in his works. But I guess that's a topic for a whole another video. Back to our topic at hand, we know Togashi really likes to humanize his villains, and does an amazing job at this. As the viewers, we're supposed to question human nature and how much it would take us to get to the point where the villains are at. Though yet again, we're not supposed to condone their actions, but rather learn from it. Another point I want to make is that whether diagnosed or undiagnosed, we meet people and they inspire us. Many characters an author decides to write are, whether consciously or not, inspired by real people. Therefore, I believe we shouldn't totally write off readings of characters through the lens of psychoanalysis and specific disorders. What I mean is, this is a subject we should always be careful with, because it can both stigmatize real conditions and make us misunderstand the author's intentions. But at the same time, it's still fun and can be useful in some cases. So the only reason I'm including this part of the analysis is because some points that can be made about Pariston when we read him as a character that has borderline personality disorder make a lot of sense with what I already said about him as of yet, and can also help us understand him and see him through a different light. So once again, remember that diagnosing fictional characters is completely subjective unless the author says otherwise. But I don't think it is necessarily wrong to associate yourself or sympathize with a fictional character more if you see the more human side of them. Which again is something that Togashi himself does a lot with his narrative. While some characters in Hunter x Hunter do exhibit traits that can be associated with a specific condition, we need to remember that they are complex characters that have much more depth to them, and just like real people, they aren't just the face of that certain condition you associate them with. And never forget that the world of Hunter x Hunter is very complex and different from ours. And the whole narrative is dependent on what Togashi himself chooses to do. Keeping this in mind, I'll go over some actions Pariston takes that could be explained by him having BPD, while still keeping in mind that he is a unique character that isn't an ideal case or example for BPD, and this analysis can only be applied to him to an extent. If we want to try seeing him in a different light and speculate more about his unknown motives and desires. And one more word before we start. I am in no way a medical professional, even though I try to get educated as well as I can in this aspect. I also asked a few friends who have the diagnosis for their opinions and insights, but I still may say something wrong, so if you are a professional or someone diagnosed with BPD and want to correct me or add something to the discussion, then again, feel free to do so in the comments. The last thing I'd want to do is to spread misinformation on a disorder that is already so heavily stigmatized and misunderstood. Unstable sense of identity. This is a BPD trait that concerns how the people affected by it have an inconsistent sense of identity. It can show in their beliefs, goals, and actions, as well as how they present externally. I've already touched on this a few times with Pariston. He seems to have inconsistent beliefs as to how he wants to be viewed by others, whether he is to be seen as weak or powerful, empathetic or scary, and so on. To what extent is what he says a manipulation tactic, and to what extent is it him changing his mind? How much does he change his morals based on the actions he chooses to do to best fit his specific goals at the moment? And how much does he believe those self-deprecating things he says about himself? Because, of course, sometimes jokes aren't just jokes, especially if you have a fluctuating or low self-esteem. There could also be the question of how much his self-image changes due to the perception of others. This means how much is he affected by how he makes people hate him, when at the same time he does demand some form of respect, at least from those he deems interesting, like Jing. And how much would he be affected by getting, or rather not getting, attention from the people he set his eyes on? And what kind of attention is the kind of attention he deems to be correct? Something about those panels when Jing confronts him makes me feel really odd. It seems he is almost spiteful, and not only when Jing misreads Netero, but when he asks him about what proof he has about wanting to destroy the association, his expression looks just straight up bitter. Jing is not only reading him like a book, he's reading him in a negative light, not mincing his words at all. To me, it didn't feel hateful from Jing, but almost like he's scolding him or judging him as if he should do better. And it seems that being seen like this is not making Pariston happy at all, even when he tries to shrug it off. I think there are the first signs of resentment he is starting to feel from being seen like this. It seems that once Pariston's emotions are actually involved, the game is not fun for him anymore. Mood swings and black and white thinking. Mood swings in BPD are often described by people as going from 0 to 100. One can go from feeling euphoric or okay to feeling intense negative emotions like deep despair or devastation. These emotions can be very intense and last hours or even days. Oftentimes, when these internal emotional shifts occur, many tend to result to impulsive behaviors to feel better, which can sometimes even be self-destructive. Other aspects of BPD is black and white thinking and splitting. If I understand it correctly, it's a cognitive process which involves the individual seeing themselves, those around them, or the world in opposing extremes. In other words, it's either all or nothing. There is no gray area in this thinking. Things or people are either good or bad, right or wrong, but nothing in between. I think both these aspects can relate to Pariston. We especially see these in his interactions with Jing. I'm not sure if I'd go as far as to say that he's definitely splitting on Jing, but he did go from being happy or excited to see him, with Jing being depicted with something that's almost a halo over his head, to absolutely hating his guts not so shortly after. Now, understandingly, anybody in his position would be annoyed with Jing, but neither we nor him have seen him like this before. This is not just annoyance, this is bottled up rage or almost bloodlust. At first, he was excited to see Jing, but as Jing continues to attack his weak spots, not letting Pariston get his way, he starts to see him in a completely different light. Jing is not just a pawn, and Pariston both loves it and hates it, depending on if he does or doesn't feel in control of the situation and his own emotions. Often after the split occurs, people may tend to forget it or that they felt something was wrong in the first place, which would also relate to Pariston being back to his usual calm self when we see him return. Though, let me say, this is just a one-time incident. We haven't seen more of Pariston getting really angry, or at least not to this extent yet, so I'd probably call it a split based on if we get more incidents like this in the future or not, but it definitely is a point worth mentioning. I also want to mention this is not the only time he looked annoyed at someone, as there were a few instances where he basically spoke through his clenched teeth. Even though he might not hate these people, since they still give him the reactions he wants them to, it surely is interesting to see him subtly display some cracks in his usually perfectly calm facade. Fear of abandonment. Another important aspect of BPD is fear of abandonment. This intense fear may lead people to sabotaging the relationships in their life, which many times may look like internalized thoughts such as, something is wrong with me, and you'll leave me eventually, so I might as well end it first. This is something I do associate with Pariston because of his iconic speech. As I said before, his sadistic tendencies to hurt the ones he loves and make others hate him feel like he's pushing away everybody on purpose and not letting them close to him at all. If somebody does get close to him, he does his best to make them hate him, also that he can avoid the pain of getting hurt by them. If he does it first and gives them a reason not to stay, it's under his own control. It's his own agency. And it's the way he believes it should be. Yet, despite this need to push everyone away, he still wants the attention, even if it's negative. Whether it be just him intentionally bringing himself down in front of others or something more extreme. As Jing said, if he beat him up, he'd probably just laugh about it. And Pariston is not denying it. It's still at least something. I know some people might think that he doesn't mind when people love and adore him, to which I'd say, fair point. I don't think he minds the attention, but I believe he'd see it as more them falling for his facade, not seeing or loving his real self. If somebody were to genuinely fall for him or genuinely love him, he'd likely see them as inferior, 'cause, let's be real, what stupid fuck would? So he'd probably see this as a free pass to hurt them even more, to have more of their attention while keeping his own emotions intact. In fact, he'd probably thrive in a toxic, abusive relationship, because he would get the attention, the reactions, and that person's hatred, keeping them close as a source of entertainment. I feel like this hatred from the other person would make him feel like it's proof that they care enough to hate him, while that person would still likely be unable to leave him due to the strength of the trauma bond he'd have created with them. Again, this part has nothing to do with him possibly having BPD. While a disorder like this might make your personal dynamics much more complicated and difficult, it's not an excuse or a reason to be abusive. What I want to say is that it's the person's choices that matter, and Pariston is, in fact, choosing to be a piece of shit. He's fully aware of his patterns and likely doesn't intend to change anything about them. He's almost enjoying it in a way, in a almost self-pitying way, I would say. But let's not get into that right now. Speaking of Pariston's very specific need for attention, this brings me to another aspect of BPD, and it's the favorite person relationship. A favorite person, or an FP, whether platonic or romantic, is someone to whom those with BPD are very attached to, to the point that they feel they almost can't live without them. Often, their life seems to be revolving around that person, enough so that they take extreme measures to maintain their favorite person's attention. We know Pariston to be a deceptive liar, but we do know of one thing that he actually is not faking, and that is how strongly he feels about Netero. Not only does he get serious when he talks about him sincerely, or when he feels his memory is not being honored enough. Basically, all he did those past 3 years was, in a sense, for Netero's attention. He caused this man all kinds of struggles, even pointing out how happily the old man groaned when he caused trouble for him. Now, I want to bring up a Reddit post. Yeah, I know, a Reddit post that is part of the reason why I started liking Pariston in the first place. I know the author has recently said something like that if they were to write about Pariston again, that they'd ignore the possible BPD aspect and just focus on him as a character, which is completely valid, but the post still brings up some interesting points, and one of them has really stuck out to me. And that point being that since Pariston did everything for Netero's attention, Netero most likely took advantage of this, since we know that he did not necessarily like Pariston. He just liked the fun obstacles that he gave him, and perhaps even took advantage of Pariston in this way, using whatever the cause for Pariston's issues is to exploit it in a way that he could have more fun with him. Now, at first, I was a bit skeptical when I read this, but then I thought about it, and yeah, it would not be out of character for Netero at all. We can't ignore that even despite the fact that he went on the extermination mission, Netero was not really a good person. He did everything he did for his own selfish purposes. He constantly ignored the weak, which even Pariston admits. He also didn't mind the hunter exams being so brutal, or the bylaws being unfair. And he even knowingly let a shady person, yes, our favorite shady person, have the highest administrative power in the association, just to have some fun. We also know that Netero can be manipulative, and as an example, I'll use how the Ant King refused to fight him until he decided to use his name as leverage so that he had to fight him. We can definitely find more examples of this, but I believe you all are aware of the fact that the chairman was doing everything in order to just have fun. Well, again, I'm not saying he's a completely evil person, I'm just saying that he is kinda selfish, and I hope you understand where I'm coming from. Basically, Pariston and Netero were very similar in quite a few things, and Pariston has a lot of respect for him, because the old guy just let him play around, and yeah, I think that's basically it. But I feel like it wouldn't be out of character for Netero to take advantage of some weaknesses of other people in order to make them fight him, because he already did that with the Ant King, and it's not an uncommon thing among hunters to do this sort of stuff. Hisoka? But on a serious note, TLDR, Pariston and Netero's relationship was very complex and very unusual, but still quite strong. Strong enough for Pariston to still care about him now, to an extent. When talking to one of my friends, they mentioned that people with BPD often find comfort in discomfort, and hence often end up in toxic or abusive relationships with people who are using them. I know that in the last section I said that Pariston would be able to become abusive, but I believe he'd be just as likely to let himself be used in a way like this. Personally, I think this dynamic would have been something that draws Pariston in, because it would hit a bit too close to home. Though now, as an adult and a very capable hunter, he tried to prove to himself that he could stay in control of a situation like this and somehow gain the upper hand over them. Either way, they were in a way using each other for entertainment and more of an intellectual sparring. Pariston chose to give so much attention to Netero instead of investing time to building any other meaningful connections elsewhere because it felt familiar to him. Netero did not love him, or in fact even like him, but he somewhat understood him and gave him some attention. Whenever he'd cause trouble, Netero was there to fix it, hence why I think it's valid that some people say he almost saw him like a father figure. Whatever Pariston's childhood was, this lack of genuine care from others is something he was used to, and receiving any attention from Netero might have validated him in that strange, complicated way that is so hard to understand. In this case, Pariston, just like many of us, decided to choose a familiar hell over unfamiliar heaven. People with BPD tend to be very loyal to those around them, and this is no different for Pariston. After Netero's death, he was still dedicated to his legacy. We could almost say that the entire election arc was basically his homage to Netero, a way to honor his memory. He might have done things that, for a normal person, would seem like sabotaging or even targeting the old man. But I'd like to remind you that this was something that Netero wanted on purpose, to keep his mind occupied. So, in a way, Pariston did exactly what Netero wanted, perfectly fulfilling his role as his personal entertainment and troublemaker for the chairman, while genuinely feeling grateful for the opportunities and attention he got in return. Pariston stays loyal to Netero's legacy even after his death, to show the hunters what him and Netero saw as a necessity: facing challenges. And man, did he give them one hell of a challenge in the election. This was something that I think even Jing missed, since everyone was so preoccupied with Pariston being annoying or even evil that all of them missed just how useful it is to have someone like him around. What I think Netero saw in him was someone who is very, very capable of showing you exactly what is wrong with the system and how exploitable it is. I believe the old chairman saw him as a necessary evil, a useful tool to find the cracks in the system. Since the bylaws allow it, he's free to misuse them and tread the line between what's allowed and not allowed. Remember, you're not supposed to target other hunters if they haven't committed heinous crimes, and you can't revoke their licenses. Who knows how their games would have gone if Netero still had been here, since to me it seems like Pariston was testing what he can get away with while Netero was patiently waiting for him to slip up, or anything that would actually be able to use against him under the bylaws. I also think that it's proof that, in a very twisted way, Pariston somehow cares about the association, which we're gonna talk about later. But regardless, he's very loyal to the game that he and Netero had. And in my humble opinion, I believe he is now also trying to gently nudge Sheila in the direction to understand their thought process and what him and Netero were actually doing. It also makes me believe that Pariston wasn't entirely dishonest about wanting to amend the bylaws, cause they let him do whatever he did the whole time. If my assessment is correct, the fact that he still wants Sheila to amend them and the exam could be proof that he does, in a very unusual way, care about the association and about what it means to be a hunter. Either way, he is extremely loyal to Netero's legacy, even though he might have opposed him in his views. Well, this was a nice little detour that I enjoyed. Yes, I am referencing Jing here, but let's get back to Pariston's armchair psychological evaluation, shall we? Quiet BPD. Now, I believe there are better typical representations of BPD in Hunter x Hunter, and Pariston may not be the perfect example, but I think that is because he resembles more of the quiet BPD subtype. Borderline personality disorder can present differently in different people, and from my understanding, quiet BPD is much more of an internalized struggle rather than externalized like the typical and more obvious cases would be. This makes it harder to detect or diagnose, as it is also masked much better. There tends to be this sense of almost over-control of one's outside presentation that oftentimes you don't get to see just how much the person is struggling if you aren't in their close circle. I think this is much more of what we see in Pariston because up until the speech he gave to Jing, we've only seen him in absolute control over both himself, his emotions, and his surroundings. But we can't really see him in the same way once he's revealed his views on love, pain, and even hate. With quiet BPD, there also tends to be this sense of internalized anger that can manifest itself as sarcasm or passive aggressiveness. We've seen a clear example of that with Pariston a few times, especially with these panels with Kansai. Now, a specific detail I've noticed is that Pariston was basically speaking through his teeth, which to me felt out of place at the time, but in retrospect, I really think he was low-key annoyed with Kansai at this point. There also tends to be this hypervigilance to wounding with quiet BPD in order to protect oneself. I think it's safe to say that Pariston is always very aware of his surroundings to an extreme extent, which is something seen in trauma survivors. Though, arguably, he learned to use this ability to read people and situations to his own benefit. Self-hatred. As I said, Pariston may not be the perfect example case for BPD, and that is mostly because of what he said in his speech, because usually people with BPD, or just people overall, tend to want to be loved and understood. But he is not the usual person. He's somebody that allegedly wants to be hated. And this, I believe, is because of Pariston's complex internalized self-hatred. I logically went over every possibility of what else might drive a person to want to be hated, and I wasn't able to find a better explanation than this. Pariston hates himself, and he believes everybody else should as well, because in his mind, he is unlovable. He makes sure he does everything in his power to make everyone hate him. He's not even afraid to hurt others at all, and perhaps even enjoys it, because I'm a shitty person, so I deserve this. I deserve to be hated because I suck. I'll do these bad things because they prove just that I'm a shitty person who should be hated. But is that so strange? If you were raised in a place where you were never shown proper love or care, would you not think the same? Since the whole world is showing you you don't deserve love, maybe that is the truth. Maybe you don't deserve it, and maybe you are a failure. And once these thoughts start swirling in your mind and you're proven that this is the case over and over and over again, you start to believe it and associate with it. And it is one very comfortable hell to live in, because it's the one that you know best. So what do you do then? Do you expose yourself to the possibility of getting hurt again? Or do you protect yourself by always taking the first step, stopping the bleeding even before you're cut? Whether Pariston has BPD or not, I hope that in this segment I've shown you just how complex his mind really is. Even though it's just a few panels that can be easily overlooked, they manage to completely dismantle our understanding of his character. Togashi doesn't waste a single stroke, and doesn't need to show us any more than he already did. Pariston is an incredibly deep character, and just these panels alone made me feel very different, not only about Pariston, but the world itself. Where would I be if my circumstances were any different? And where would you? The world is an incredibly dark place to live in if you don't have the support system you need. Every child deserves to be loved, and if all they feel from a very young age is pain, and it becomes all they know, if they don't feel like there is any hope that things will change for the better, they will go on and spread that pain, hurting themselves and others in the process. I know many of us who like Pariston tend to draw most attention to his silly side, but we all know that there's much more to why we're so drawn to him. In some aspects, Pariston is a deeply relatable character for many of us, and he seems to be drawing in many people who just get him. While many readers might have brushed off these few panels, there is a reason why you or me didn't, and there is probably a reason why you're still watching this video right now. And that is, just like me, for you, those words hit deeply. Because it's not just malice that we see in there. It's a deep struggle, almost a cry for help of a person who is struggling so much that he himself might not even realize it. If writing this analysis made me realize anything, it's that some people will literally harbor 5,000 chimera ant eggs instead of reaching out for help. I think a lot of characters in Hunter x Hunter are meant to be seen as cautionary tales, and Pariston is not an exception. Inside of everyone, there is still a small part of what used to be the child that deserved to be loved. And once we grow up, it's up to us to show that part of ourselves the love that we might have lacked, and not try to repeatedly seek out those familiar negative patterns from our past. Feeding into that pain, even if it feels good in the moment, even if it feels like the only thing that Pariston knows, is wrong. Because what feels like the comfortable, familiar warmth of his own personal hell is what could eventually end up burning him alive. What Hunter x Hunter often shows us is that while you're still living, there is no reason to condemn yourself as if you were already damned. We see this over and over again, with many characters getting lost in their obsessions. Whether it be revenge or power or anything, I think Togashi is trying to show us that we need to be careful not to get lost in what we want, and rather find that perfect balance between what we want and what we already have. He himself might be an example of this. Not only did he get completely burned out by the end of writing Yu Yu Hakusho, he has serious health issues that he needs to take care of. We can only hope that he's also taken an example from his works and takes it easy in the future, because especially in the manga industry, one's overwhelming amount of work can lead to severe consequences. So, if you need to take away anything from this part of the video, Do not be like Pariston. Do not refuse help or shield your heart just because of the possibility of getting hurt that seems too scary to bear sometimes. It takes a lot of courage to break through your own walls and break your old toxic patterns, but nobody else will do that for you. And yeah, do not be like Pariston in general. It's not a good look to be responsible for 18 people going missing, as well as creating an army of 5,000 superhuman soldiers that could take over the world at any given moment. So, yeah. Originally, I wanted to end this segment here, but I've been making this video for almost 4 or 5 months now, and I had a few more realizations about Pariston's mind that I believe I should still mention. First of all, self-preservation seems to be Pariston's main subconscious motivating factor for how he's acting. He wants attention, yet doesn't feel comfortable with people getting too close to understanding the real him. And the reason for that, I think, is that he has both abandonment issues and trust issues. What a nice combination indeed. His fear of being vulnerable or weak is part of what leads him to aim to control the people around him, and also himself. Unlike outside circumstances, his emotions are the only thing he is fully able to control at all times, which is a big issue for him once Jing enters the picture. Another thing that I wanted to go over are the roses. Originally, I went over the dying roses in the panel a little too fast, but I think they're there for a reason. Symbolically, of course. I think in Pariston's mind, love can be beautiful, but also painful and fleeting. Being vulnerable is not worth it to him, because he thinks it would eventually all end the same. Love doesn't last. It should only be approached superficially, otherwise you just get hurt, is what I believe he believes. Bitterness is something else that I kind of noticed and mentioned a few times in connection to Pariston. And I know some people online expressed the sentiment that Pariston probably doesn't feel empathy and might even have ASPD, which I don't think is the case. I think it's more likely that he has a very specific mindset. On a surface level, he'd probably say that the unethical actions he takes are just a means to an end. But if we were to dig deeper, I think we'd see that he very likely feels like this. I've been hurt, and now I enjoy seeing others go through the same. I was owed love that I never received. Life is not fair. All people should learn that. He feels both bitter and disillusioned with the world. This man would look at you dead in the eyes and say, "Oh, so you're easy to manipulate? Well, that's a skill issue." But seriously, in his mind, people are easy to manipulate. And he probably wouldn't let that happen to him, he believes. Not at this point, at least. To him, it's fair to manipulate others and perhaps even hurt them, because that's the world we live in. His actions are fair in his mind, because if this world allows it, then it will happen. It's survival of the fittest. If, from whatever situations he comes from, he could have become this strong, so can others, so it's fair, because the world won't change. Instead, you have to change to fit the world. I also am inclined to believe that he was being somewhat genuine with his aim to quote-unquote protect the weaker hunters, since he himself may believe that he can relate to them. I mean, we've only seen him fight on the intellectual front so far, but to me, he seems like someone who is willing to put in the hard work. But people should have equal opportunities to get better. He might even feel like his opportunity from Netero was, in a way, unfair. After all, the more potential challengers he'd have, the more fun for him, right? He wants to push limits, and not just everyone else's, but also his own. I know this last point might sound a bit hypocritical at first, but this would be far from the first or last example of a Hunter x Hunter character being a little hypocrite. Instead, what I want to propose is that he might not feel bad for the things he does, in a sense, because, again, as I said, he believes getting manipulated and used is a bit of a skill issue. So whatever happened to the 18 missing hunters is not really contradicting him wanting an equal opportunity for everyone to get better. He might not be doing this out of empathy, but instead to get more opponents or have more fun, I think. Maybe. Actually, what is this mischievous rat up to? Pariston's true motives. First of all, I want to mention the fact that all the power we've seen Pariston display was just his sheer intelligence. Though we arguably have seen him display some hostile ren, and we know that he is a triple star hunter, which is a rare display of skill given the fact that there are only about 10 of them. I don't think Pariston has been seen displaying any Nen ability for a few reasons. Firstly, he is very secretive. We know that in Nen combat, knowledge is everything, so he doesn't want or need to give it away yet. Then I also believe that whatever his ability is, he doesn't want to use it unless necessary. And I believe so just because he likes challenges. And also, controlling people in a world which is about sheer display of power through other means than the power itself is a good ego boost for just about anyone. As I mentioned before, he seems to have some sense of fairness, but not like a normal person. It's more like in his own twisted little Pariston way. In other words, the game wouldn't be fun if he has an advantage because of his ability. But whatever the case is, it's quite impressive that he managed to become such a threat through just his brain power alone. Now, the question is he weak like it was implied? And the answer is, who knows? He's too good at hiding anything from everyone, including us, the readers. But it also has to be said that he remains extremely calm even with displays of incredible power, such as when Nanika was healing Gon, or when Jing was taunting him by flashing his Ren. That means, most likely, either he is so strong that he doesn't have a reason to fear such strong displays of power, and we shouldn't underestimate him. Or he is really in fact just not afraid of sheer power alone, and the only way to get a reaction out of him is by taking away his control, like Jing does. Either way, whether he is strong or weak, Pariston is extremely hard to intimidate. To get to a point where we can discuss the potential true motives of Pariston, we need to ask ourselves a few questions first. A. What are Pariston's values, and what does he actually care about? And B. Has he ever been truthful about any of these desires or implied values? This is going to be much harder to answer because Pariston often contradicts himself with his words and his actions. Sheila herself has said that he's never saying what he's truly thinking, which I think can be applied to an extent, But I don't think that is entirely the truth. Let's start with what I think he genuinely cares about, to an extent at least, and that is Netero's legacy. In the last section, I already went over this a bit with his loyalty to Netero, so I won't be repeating those words, just giving my general thoughts. Jing said that out of the last 4 candidates, Pariston was the only one going in Netero's steps. We, as readers, do know that he actually did have some respect for Netero, given the sad look he gave to Cheadle, and his strong reaction when Jing, in his eyes, misunderstood how Netero would act had he still been alive. Despite this, however, he is still able to make somewhat disrespectful remarks, or use Netero's legacy as leverage or a tool for manipulating the Zodiacs during the election. So there is the question, has there been a time when he said something he was honestly thinking, and we just couldn't see it through the layers of irony and assholery? I personally think that even despite his actions, like the 18 missing hunters, he cares about the association in his own twisted way. Pariston has a clear idea in his mind as to what the association should be like, and that is, in his own words, supposed to be not boring. We know that he is somewhat obsessed with the association, to an extent, as he wanted to play with it for as long as possible, and talking about the association is basically what brought on his whole love speech. He loves the association, but as we know, he has the twisted sense of love where he wants to harm it. There is the question how far his need to harm what he loves goes, and whether he means it in a way that he wants to keep throwing obstacles at the association in order for it to grow in a direction that he deems acceptable for his standards, or if he is just completely malicious and wants to utterly destroy what he loves. So the question is, does he love it in an abusive dance mom who wants to see their child do their best even if it hurts them kind of way? Or in a I love you so much I have to destroy you kind of way? Though I have reasons to believe it may be the former option. Now, hear me out on this one. Let me cook here, alright? Pariston is a good example of what a hunter should be. I'm planning to make a whole video on what I think Hunter x Hunter is all about and what it means to be a quote-unquote good hunter, but I'll quickly go over it. I think there are a few characters who are brilliant examples of what hunters should be. Namely Jing, both Netero's, Pariston, Hisoka, Gon, and a few others. We know that hunters are selfish creatures, and this is shown over and over again. According to the first hunter bylaw, hunters must always be on the hunt for something. And we know that many of them are willing to sacrifice anything to achieve these goals. One other common aspect common in what I call good hunters is that they love challenges, and Pariston is, of course, no exception to this. We know that he is constantly looking for a worthy opponent in a way, and he might sincerely believe the association should be a certain way, and he's not afraid to hurt it in order to force it to become his ideal. Because he thinks to be a hunter means you need to face challenges, and a boring association would be almost an insult to the concept of what hunters are supposed to be in the first place. Moreover, his expression when Jing accuses him of wanting to destroy the association really feels like almost disdain. He could either be mad that Jing figured him out, or he might be offending that he's misreading him, especially after also misreading Netero just a few moments prior. Speaking of Pariston's love for challenges, he was playing with Netero for a long time, And since losing his favorite toy, he was trying to poke the association until something would come out of it eventually. And he was quite successful at that, given the fact that he got the attention that he longed for so much from none other than the legendary Gene Freaks. Though I also want to mention that I think there is one aspect that may differentiate Pariston from the other good hunters I mentioned. And it's one that he might even have opposed Netero's philosophy in, and that is strength. As I said before, we can't yet know how weak or strong Pariston is, but we do know that the topic of weakness was mentioned enough times with his character in the manga. Not only did Netero only play with him on the intellectual level, he himself called himself weak, as well as Jing did. And of course, we know that anything Pariston says might very likely be a lie or a manipulation tactic, but we also know he's not afraid to use things he actually somewhat cares about to use as a manipulative tool as well. So this might be a stretch, but in a sense, he might actually, to some extent, want to stand for or represent the weak hunters, or hunters who are not strong in the traditional sense. Given how many times the topic of being weak was used in connection to his character, I think being weak may play an important role in his character in the future, in one way or another. So, with all that being said, what are Pariston's real goals and motives? It might be as simple as having fun and causing as much havoc as he can, given his shared traits with Hisoka, but it may as well be something much deeper and more complex. There are many theories out there, and feel free to speculate in the comments below, but I'll chime in with my own thoughts. Personally, I don't really understand why people tend to think that Pariston is just a simple character, given that we've been already shown very important glimpses into what he is actually like, and I don't think his motives will be anything really simple. So feel free to speculate, as I've said already like 10 times in this video. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, but I don't think it's anything simple. I think his actual motives might be tied to his past, and one reason for that is that I am finding some uncanny resemblances between him and Morena, which I will not go into in this video. I might once I start doing a Morena analysis in the future, but I think their backstories might be a bit similar in some way, or at least the feelings that they both are displaying. So I just wanted to throw that out there, but now let's get to the more tangible evidence and some theories that are a bit more explored. There are two interesting theories surrounding Pariston, and we'll really quickly go over them in this video. So take some popcorn and put on your tinfoil hats, cause it's gonna get real interesting. First, there is the theory that Pariston was heavily involved with the Chimera Ants and Netero's death. Here's a great video by New World Review that summarizes the theory, so I won't be going into much detail, but in short, it is very convenient that the only obstacle beyond Netero had from going to the DC, his own father, was removed due to a threat that is almost impossible to spontaneously get into our world, let alone a country where a Chimera Ant invasion would conveniently be able to start freely with no major setbacks whatsoever. Moreover, the Ant Queen had traces of human DNA, which either means there are people in the Dark Continent, or that she was intentionally bred and fed human DNA to be more intelligent by default. This would mean that Beyond very likely stuffed his big-ass pockets with some ants while he was in the Dark Continent, and had enough time over the past 50 years to breed the perfect weapon that would simultaneously let him have his way and grant his father a graceful death, in a sense. Dying fighting a worthy opponent is what I mean by that. Pariston would help him orchestrate this, and together they'd execute the plan to gain access to the Dark Continent. I said help orchestrate, or he could have at least known about it, but we know that Pariston's stamps are on Beyond's team, so I don't think there is much of a question. If this theory is true, it confirms that Pariston would indeed go to any lengths, even getting rid of a rival that he respected and enjoyed his time with. It also makes his crying scene much more twisted if you see it through the lens that he knows he is partially the reason he can't play with the old chairman anymore. And it also means that Netero was nearly not enough of a fun game for him to continue playing with him, and basically the old man had served his purpose in those 3 years as just a side quest for Pariston that he had in his longer game. We know that Pariston wanted to go to the Dark Continent, and now the question is why? Is it because he wants to use some resources from the Dark Continent? Or is it because he hopes it will just be fun? Or that he'll get to mess with the people going there in a much more sinister way? Pariston might have just as well been headed there to the Dark Continent for other reasons. Some much more natural to being a hunter. I'd even go as far as to say that it might have been his only goal all along, his main objective, when compared to the side quests he's been doing so far. And what we'll discuss next may just be an explanation and a confirmation for this. Before we start delving into my simplified version of the theory, I want to say 2 things. This theory has been already covered many times before, and many people have their own takes on it. So here I'm featuring some of the sources as well as the original post, so you can get a clearer picture of all the possible evidence that leads to this theory. It might sound like a stretch at first, but I think it's possibly the most interesting and one of the more likely Hunter x Hunter theories out there. And it absolutely wouldn't be out of character for Togashi to write a plot twist like this. So I believe Togashi wants us readers to pay close attention to his works and draw our own conclusion from the hints he leaves. I think there are far too many hints that point to this theory being at least partially true for it to just be written off as a coincidence. I could make a whole hour video on this theory alone, and I might even do it at some point, but for now I believe this video will be long enough that it could get tiring if I stretch it out even more and overload you with so much information. I'll summarize the main points I see repeated as well as add a few of my own, but I suggest you look into the theory because it's really fun. Or not really so fun if you care for Kurapika's well-being, but still very interesting indeed. So let's go over some of the main claims or versions of the Sheila is Pariston theory, or theories, and some things I noticed that I haven't necessarily seen mentioned before. The 2 theories, which I won't go into detail with, are that either Sheila is herself responsible for Sarasa's death and that was somehow caused by the Kurta village. If Sheila is Pariston and poor Sarasa was her friend, it would explain why she ended up dead, maybe, and why Sheila had an almost guilty expression leaving the troop. Sheila then went to find the hidden Kurta village, met Kurapika and Pyro, gave them the Hunter book, and told the troop about them afterwards, which we know she is tied to them from their backstory. Another version of the theory basically says that the Kurta clan are from the Dark Continent, which would explain the scarlet eyes as well as some of the symbols connecting the place and the people. So the Kurta came to our world and basically as a calamity destroyed a part of it that is now known as Meteor City. The people spread the message across generations, hence why the Kurta couldn't leave their forest, and if they were spotted with the scarlet eyes, people were panicking that the red-eyed devils are back. The troop would either be financially rewarded by Meteor City or act out of their own incentive, as we know that they are from there and seem to care about the place quite a lot. Either way, it seems like Sheila being there is no coincidence, especially after it's reported that a lone female traveler found the village after the massacre had occurred. Sheila somehow causing the Kurta disaster is the most likely part of the theory for me, and if she really is Pariston, it would have many, many implications and open up a lot of possibilities for new theories. And it would give us an even much more dark lens to see Pariston through. As I said before, I just summarized the theories really fast, but the posts go in much more detail and have some interesting supporting evidence, so I suggest reading them. But that's not all I wanted to say about the theory. Here are some more similarities between the two characters, beginning with the more superficial ones. First, we have to go over the overall similar appearance, which I think is uncanny to say the least. Some people may say that some of Togashi's characters look alike, and Man is definitely a fan of skinny, pretty blonde guys, but I also heard people point out how Togashi basically makes his characters' eyes very unique, which as an artist who draws many of them, especially Pariston, yes, the eyes are very, very different for each character, and Pariston's eyes are especially unique and hard to depict. So it really is odd that this other deceptive character would have such similar eyes for no reason. Unless, Togashi just subconsciously associates innocent-looking eyes with manipulative traits. Moreover, Sheila is also wearing the rat ears, which of course is connecting her to Pariston, who's the rat zodiac. Another thing I haven't seen mentioned much is how similar her and his mannerisms are. Just like with Pariston, we see some emphasis on Sheila's body language and gestures, especially with the hands. And her expressions and his also seem very similar in some panels. And let's not forget that in the true backstory, Sheila is asked to take on a double role, which, if this theory is true, also checks out. One thing I personally noticed is how Sheila both is and isn't a part of the group. She is a part of the four that started the play, but when she's with the group in some panels, she's seen as almost distancing herself, and also ends up leaving them altogether when Crollo announces his plan. This is a parallel to Pariston because he too is a part of the Zodiacs, but not really, or at least not in the way that the others are. Firstly, not following Netero's furry code and all that. He doesn't fit in with them on purpose, standing out and holding his own opposing opinions, and also ends up leaving them in the end, like Sheila did with the troop. I also find it interesting, as we don't get that much said from Sheila, that Togashi would go out of his way to add a comment about how Sheila believes a hunter should wear whatever they want, which perfectly aligns with our eccentric suit Ratman, and would also align with either Sheila or Pariston being either in a disguise, cross-dressing, or even being trans. Shout out to canonically trans Togashi characters, by the way. My next point is that Sheila ends up hurting her leg very often, and it's implied that it might be on purpose to stay longer around Kurapika and Pyro. If it is intentionally inflicted self-injury, that is another link to Pariston and his self-harm panel. Sheila's dress is also very reminiscent to Pariston's doll, and the missing eye in the doll could hint at the Curta tragedy. And if Pariston's panels hint at being an unloved and unwanted child, it can relate to the unwanted children of Meteor City, one of which Sheila is. Speaking of fashion and dress up, Pariston's name is derived from Paris Hilton, a woman. Alright, this might be more of a joke, but it's still an interesting choice of name for a male character. Also, if you want some food for thought, it could also be a hint at Paris from Greek mythology, which could have some parallels to Pariston's story, but we don't have time for that now. Speaking of dolls, it has been pointed out many times before that Togashi's characters who were gender ambiguous or don't fit the traditional gender roles are connected to dolls and puppets, which would again hint at Pariston possibly belonging amongst them as well. Sheila is also depicted looking at us, the readers, with her secretive expression, in contrast to Kurapika and Pyro, which could be Togashi attempting to break the fourth wall in this panel in a way, to let the readers know about her less than nice intentions. If she's responsible for the massacre, she is deceptive and manipulative, as well as malicious, just like our favorite secretive rat. There are also some symbolic ties with some numbers, for example 18 and Pariston being the missing hunters on page 180, and the number having a connection to the moon card in the major arcana in tarot, which is mostly linked to one's subconscious or even dark or shadow self, secrets, deception, and so on. Speaking of, I also can't really ignore the fact that there are some angel numbers connected to Pariston, which also could be an interesting thing to look into if we get any more of them with his character. But let's get back to Sheila. My last supporting point for the theories is that Sheila's goal is to become a hunter. It's her biggest dream. And Pariston, coincidentally, happens to be not only a hunter, but a triple star hunter, one of the only 10 hunters to hold that status. Based on what I said earlier, if he were Sheila, it would also justify Pariston's respect for Netero and his obsession with the association, as he'd be very fixed on what it means to be a hunter and how the association is supposed to be. It would also mean that his goal with the Dark Continent is maybe just to get there, cause it is the ultimate dream for any hunter, and he could go on to live his or Sheila's childhood fantasy that she kept reading about in her favorite book. If this theory turns out to be true to any extent, which would be wild but also not unexpected, it means many things. One of them being, you really don't want to be Sheila or Pariston's friend. This person would likely be responsible for the deaths of Sarasa, the Curta clan, including the brutal way that Pyro was executed, as well as almost undoubtedly the late chairman, the 18 missing hunters, probably also the entire NGL, and definitely many more we don't know about yet. If Sheila is Pariston, he really has one of the most incredible body counts in the entire series, even if he didn't kill anybody with his bare hands. And that's all I'm gonna say about the Pariston theories. There is one more topic we can touch upon briefly when talking about this mysterious, mischievous man, and that is his ability. It's one topic that is sparking a lot of debate, and the video by No World Review again has many interesting suggestions, so I recommend you give it a watch. However, this is my video, so I'm entitled to talk about the one possibility I find most fascinating. Again, feel free to discuss in the comments. And that is, what if Pariston's ability is linked to gaining power from the hatred of others? This would make him very powerful, especially so if he had a restriction where he'd get even stronger if he makes someone he loves hate him. He'd be even more formidable. And I don't think this would be unlikely given how, well, some Nen restrictions are. Some allow you to get stronger the more you sacrifice. The best example is of course Kurapika's Emperor time, which makes him literally lose years of his life. So it wouldn't be at all odd if someone had an ability which would make them sacrifice the one they care most about. This actually, in a way, already worked with Pakunoda. Shout out to the people who paid attention to that. It is a very dark, berserky scenario, but knowing Pariston, he'd somehow make it work. Probably the best out of all the Hunter x Hunter characters we know. Now, I believe I've yapped enough at this point, and I went over many important points I wanted to, though I'm sure I could go on for hours. There is way more that could be said about Pariston, and I might realize I wanted to say much more later on, in which case I'll either add more in the comments or just make a new video on its own. All that being said, thank you for the immense support on my last video, thanks for all the likes and all that stuff, and thank you for watching this video as well. It was quite fun to try and analyze a character we know so little of, but I couldn't help it. He is an enigmatic and captivating character that has a way of catching our attention. Before I end the video, as a fellow Hunter x Hunter artist, I have to share some Pariston art that I really loved. So feel free to give those artists some love, because they're doing God's work out there. There is never enough Pariston on the internet, so it's great to see his fans being still active, even when we're getting zero Pariston content from the big man himself. Whoop! You thought the video was ending? Not entirely. I still have one last thing to say. And that is, over the months I spent analyzing this character, I couldn't help but wonder why I, and many others, find myself so drawn to him, or people like him. So, the last question I want to pose in this video is, why do we love villains? In case you can't tell by now, Pariston is my favorite character, perhaps of all time, closely followed by Morena right now. I had a big problem accepting this for a long time though, because Pariston is a terrible person. How could he be my favorite? But then I thought about it. I thought about what draws me to this character so much, despite him going so strongly against my moral compass. So why are we drawn to villains? I came to a very interesting conclusion. I'm speaking to those of you who have been just as confused or conflicted about this as I was. Perhaps you love them so much, despite their own flaws and wrongdoings, silently hoping that one day someone would give you the same courtesy and understanding. That someone else would show you that you are able to be loved despite your flaws. We see parts of ourselves in the most broken characters, silently hoping that they get the redemption we seek for ourselves. Sometimes we love villains because in reality we want the deepest, darkest parts of ourselves to be seen and accepted, the way that we do with them. We love them because they aren't forcing themselves to be good anymore, letting go of the burdens of everyone else's expectations, often getting misunderstood or just completely brushed off as evil for the sake of being evil. We love them because they reflect our deepest fears, regrets, and desires. that many times we don't even want to see or acknowledge in ourselves. We love them because secretly we yearn to accept ourselves, even the parts that we don't want to admit that we have. We love them because we believe that just like them, we always deserved to be loved. Or, I don't know, we just love seeing them destroy shit out of spite, because we're all good law-abiding citizens in here, right? Or maybe being a little evil is just hot. I don't know. That's all from me now. Have a good one. You'll see me when you see me again. And if you like and subscribe to give me some attention after spending literal months on this, I may not unleash a secret army of 5,000 regular ants in your bedroom. Well, that's it. See ya.